All right, guys, we are live. This is the Difference Makers podcast. I'm your host, Justin Tamani. Today we have with us Liz Soutter. Liz is a Harvard and Columbia grad. She's a former Division I rower with Harvard. She is also the former Director of Athlete Services with U.S. Rowing and currently a sport manager with the World Rowing Federation. So welcome, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
So that's a big resume right there. So tell me a little bit about how you got involved with U.S. Rowing and the World Rowing Federation. Give me a little bit about your background here.
Yeah, sure. As you said, I was a rower for a long time. I rowed in university. And after I graduated from university, I decided that I didn't want to keep rowing. In the United States, women's rowing is really, really competitive. And for me, it felt like the options were to continue rowing at a very elite level in either a really competitive club or trying to make maybe the Canadian national team or stepping away from the sport. It didn't feel like at the time there should be a middle ground just because I was training at such a high level. It would have felt strange to step away and sort of row recreationally. So I took a step back from the sport and ended up just through my connections in the sport, meeting the people at US Rowing. And they, at the time, were looking for someone to work in their national team department to manage athlete services, work with the national team rowers, handle things like their uniform, health insurance, trips, things like that. So it was my first job out of university, and it was a great experience. It was a very small organization. I think people think, the Olympic team is managed by hundreds and hundreds of people, and it's really not. There were 3 of us managing the entire national rowing team program. But it was a great experience. I was there for 6 years. And through that experience and through traveling to events internationally, I also made connections at the World Rowing Federation. And in 2018, I was ready for a new challenge. And I was lucky that the World Rowing Federation had an opportunity for me to go over there. So I've been there for about almost 3 years now.
Amazing. So with the U.S. rowing team, we'll just start there. Tell me a little bit about what you did to help the program, to move the program along, to help the athletes. Give me a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think it's important to understand I was in a very sort of managerial and administrative role. And I learned pretty early that nothing I did would make the athletes go faster. I wasn't a coach. I wasn't like a sports scientist. Nothing I did would make them go faster, but me not doing my job properly could impact their performance and make them go slower. So I really tried to focus on making sure that when they were training or when they were traveling internationally, they could be in a position to just focus on competing, and they could be in a position to just focus on themselves. Professional athletes do have to be quite selfish in a way. They have to be able to turn off all of the outside distractions and just focus on their game and just focus on their sport. So when you're supporting professional athletes, you need to really allow them to do that, and creating an environment for them to be able to do that is really important. So I would be doing really anything that fit that bill, planning trips, dealing with international visas, air travel, booking their accommodations, dealing with transportation on site once they arrive to events. In advance of international travel, we had a whole selection process where athletes were selected to compete internationally. And that would involve running different competitions and regattas to select those athletes. So I would support the operations of those regattas, dealing with their parents who want to come watch them internationally and selling them tickets. Any crises that popped up, if an athlete gets sick in a foreign country or, slips and falls and you have to take them to a Polish emergency room. I really have like a laundry list of strange, weird experiences that I've had to deal with internationally. But really, like at the end of the day, the whole goal was to support Team USA and support the US rowers to just allow them to do their best on race day.
Now, as a Canadian, was it a little conflict of interest to work with the U.S. rowing team?
I think a lot of people are surprised when I tell them that I'm Canadian, but I was managing the US team because, they think there's some kind of conflict of interest. I mean, so many in sports, so many coaches come from other countries, and they go where the job is. And I think as a sport administrator, it's the same thing. Of course, it would be an amazing experience to work with the Canadian Olympic team. And I definitely have a lot of patriotism towards Canada. But I got to know the US team pretty well, and I have a lot of dear friends who are rowers on the US team. And once you kind of make those personal connections, you just want to support them like for the people that they are and not necessarily for the passports that they hold. Definitely. So no, I don't think there was any like major conflicts of interest.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah.
With your current position with the World Rowing Federation, you guys have done a lot to diversify the sport of rowing in the past couple of years, and I think that you had a big part to do with that. I know that you guys introduced the World Urban Games in 2019. What was explain to me the format and what you guys were trying to achieve with the World Urban Games and how that contributed to rowing and the World Organization.
Yeah, I think to kind of take a step back, it's important to understand that there's different kinds of rowing. So my personal experience and as a rower and also managing the US team was very much focused on sort of traditional collegiate Olympic style rowing, these long skinny boats that row on flat water. Now working at World Rowing, I focus on actually all of the disciplines of rowing that are not Olympic rowing. So I oversee indoor rowing, which is using the rowing machine, what you do at a CrossFit gym. Coastal rowing, which is like fatter boats on the ocean and you're sort of dealing with wind and waves, and Paralympic rowing. And so I deal with the non-Olympic disciplines of rowing at World Rowing. And with indoor rowing, there's a huge opportunity to engage people who didn't grow up rowing in the traditional discipline. So people who didn't join a rowing club at a young age or start rowing in university. Indoor rowing is something that is really accessible, and people can use an indoor rowing machine at their gym or at their CrossFit box. And it's kind of like weightlifting. You know, you might get introduced to the sport at your CrossFit gym and then decide, oh, I actually really like this. You know, I really like this training tool, or I really like this modality, and I want to dabble in it a little bit more. And as World Rowing, our mission is to grow the sport of rowing in any way, shape, or form internationally. And so for us, there's a huge opportunity there to bring in that person that finds the rowing machine at their local gym and say, hey, you know, you should dip your toe in this. You should try to compete internationally or compete locally or regionally. I think with that and with that goal, we need to do our job as World Rowing to update the competitive format of indoor rowing. I think a lot of people maybe aren't familiar with indoor rowing competitions, but they're traditionally a very sort of standard format. They're 2,000 meters. There are some that also do 500 meters, but essentially it's 2,000 meters. You show up, you row 2,000 meters, and then you're ranked based on your fastest time. And the 2K is a brutal test of fitness. Don't get me wrong, but it's horrible. If you've done one, you know it's really brutal. But like any sport, if it's repeatable, if it's repeatable to that degree, then it's not so interesting to watch or to compete in, because you can kind of predict going into the event who's going to do well. You know, competitors can predict within fractions of a second how they're going to do. And 2,000 meters is also the distance that on-water rowers train for their whole lives. So there's a huge bias towards those athletes, the more sort of traditional on-water rowers, doing really well in indoor competitions. And that might discourage some people who don't come from that background to want to compete in indoor rowing. So one thing we're looking at is how can we change the race format, or how can we open up the race format so that it levels the playing field a little bit, and it gives, you know, the average athlete, not just the average rower, a better chance at succeeding in indoor rowing. And that was something that we tested at the World Urban Games. The World Urban Games was a new event, a multi-sport event that was held in Budapest in 2019. And their goal was really to bring sport into the city and showcase, sports that are not in the Olympic Games that are maybe really easy for someone to pick up or really accessible. They wanted to engage kids. They wanted to engage young people. And indoor rowing was lucky enough to be selected as a showcase sport in the World Urban Games. So
Nice.
When we were thinking of how to present indoor rowing, we really tried to do something different and not just row 2K and have everyone, get up after 6 or 7 minutes and wipe their hands and leave. But we tried to do a more interesting format. We had, I think, 6 events over the course of 3 days, and all the athletes that competed got to race in 6 completely different events. Each event was testing different skills, different modalities. And then at the end of the day, it was sort of the overall winner, the master of the machine. And that was really cool. And in that event, we did get a mix of rugby players, rowers, CrossFitters, cyclists, people that came from all different walks of life and all different sports competing and doing really well.
Now, let's be honest. Was one of those events the fish game?
We didn't do the fish game, although I'm not opposed to it. I think it would be a really cool, event to do. I think whenever you're trying to change a format that's so ingrained in history, and like rowing is a very traditional sport. It has a long history behind it. It's the oldest collegiate sport in the world, I think.
Okay.
And World Rowing is the oldest international federation of all the international federations. So there's like a whole, historical piece that goes into rowing. It's definitely difficult to be someone who wants to make a difference and who wants to mix things up and shake things up, because you have people who are very married to the traditional idea of how the sport should be done. Yeah. So I think, I know you were saying this as a joke with the fish game, but it's something that it would be cool to do that at one point, but you need to get the buy-in from all these traditionalists and people who love the way it is now to see your vision and to love your vision, so that eventually you can kind of branch into doing crazier, more interesting things like the fish game.
I love the fish game on the rower, but if for people who don't know, we're talking about the concept too. Rowers have this game built in called the fish game. It's fun. I like it a lot. But I 100% understand what you're saying. With those events that you picked for the urban games for rowing, what events did you do? Because I can get an idea of some of them, but give me a little look at what you guys chose and potentially why you chose some of them.
So we tried to choose really anything that was not a traditional 2K. We looked at what we do normally in events, and then we tried to get as far away from that as we could, within the confines of what was logistically possible. And I think a whole element of indoor rowing competitions that people might not recognize is there's a whole timing element of it. So we worked with a timing company, and they were able to pull the data out of the machine and then kind of graphically show it on a big screen. And that's, relatively straightforward to do if you're doing a straight distance race like a 2K or a 500 meter. But once you start to add different variables into that, you really need to have a company that's able to do custom graphics and able to show those results in a way that makes sense to an audience. But they need to create all of that from scratch. So we worked with an amazing timing company that was able to allow us to do these crazy formats. So I can give you a couple of examples. We did one that was, we actually had an Instagram vote on the World Rowing Official Instagram account, where we said the first event will be a 6K, so 6 kilometers. The athletes either will have a rate cap of 14 strokes per minute, so they can't take more than 14 strokes per minute, or they will have a rate floor of 36 strokes per minute. So they can't take any fewer strokes than 36 strokes per minute. And for people who aren't familiar with rowing, I'll say that a rate of 14 is uncomfortably slow.
Yeah.
And a rate of 36 is uncomfortably high. And 6K it's not short, it's you're getting into the sort of mid 20 minute timing. So to be uncomfortably slow or uncomfortably high for that long is not ideal. And it was right at the cusp of where you would feel comfortable rowing. So I think we had like 52% vote for the rate cap of 14 strokes per minute. So the athletes basically rode 6K and they were taking about one stroke every like 6 seconds. So they take a stroke and they come back really slowly. And it was uncomfortable for, especially the traditional rowers struggled a lot with that event. They were super uncomfortable with it versus the CrossFitters who are used to maybe doing some more explosive lifts, and they're not so like, their muscle memory isn't so connected to rowing at like a smooth, consistent pace, like someone who trains on the rowing machine their whole life. The CrossFitters actually did really well sticking to the cap. And what we had to do is if you went over a rate 14, you got like a penalty, a 2-second penalty added onto your time at the end. So all of the traditional rowers had like, a minute of penalties, and the CrossFitters had like 4 seconds, 5 seconds of penalties. So it was really interesting to watch.
That's a very interesting event. Like that is, like you said, it's uncomfortably slow to go 14.
Totally.
Like most people who have been on rowers before don't even think about their stroke rate. Most CrossFitters and kind of the average person just goes.
Yeah. It's like anything, right? It's like if you went on a run, you don't think about, how quickly am I touching my feet down to the ground? What's my running rate? And obviously, as you become more sport specific, that is something you would think about. But it was interesting just to see how the different athletes and the backgrounds that they came from, how that affected their ability to take on these events. I'll give you an example of another event we did, which was hands down my favorite one to watch. But we did one event. So we had 8 athletes competing at the same time. And we did a 35-minute event. So 35-minute row. And every 5 minutes, we reset the meters that they'd rowed to 0. So every 5 minutes, the meters that they'd rowed would go back to 0. And whoever had rowed the least number of meters in that 5 minutes was eliminated. So what you saw were these athletes who were kind of coasting, they didn't want to go too hard for the first like 3 minutes of the 5-minute increment. And then the last 2 minutes, they'd start to look around and see the other guys picking it up. And so they would accelerate and just to not be last. And so the goal every 5 minutes was to not be the slowest in that 5 minutes. But of course, if you went, full out, you emptied the gas tank on the first 5 minutes, it didn't give you an advantage going to the second 5 minutes because the counter reset to 0. So you had to kind of game it. You didn't want to be first and tire yourself out, but you didn't want to be last. You wanted to be somewhere in the middle. And as people got eliminated, that became harder and harder and harder to do. And that event was so fun to watch. I mean, people were glued to the stage for 35 minutes, which is a long event, watching these athletes try to tick each other off one by one.
That's pretty awesome. And so it wasn't cumulative. So each section had to row. So what were athletes, male or female, averaging for that 5 minute? Can you remember?
I can't remember, but I mean, again, like the averaging, didn't really matter. I would say probably the women were going pretty easy in the first 3 minutes, like maybe a 155, very sort of base cadence pace for them. And a lot of them were just looking at what is everyone else pulling, and I'll pull that. I don't want to be too fast. I don't want to be too far ahead of them. So I'll just pull what they're pulling. So they'd probably coast around like a 155 for the first 3 minutes. And then at the end, they would just do whatever they had to do to not be last. So we saw people dipping into the 130s, sprinting down into 130s, high 120s. But again, it was entirely dependent on what other rowers are doing. So like in a 2K, and as someone who comes from a very traditional rowing background, you're sort of taught, you go in with your race plan. You don't let other people influence your race plan. You row your race, you keep your head in the boat. Like these are all very sort of traditional rowing expressions. And you're really trying to max your effort out. So you can't allow yourself to be influenced by other people because it will mess up your race plan. You'll go too fast, too soon, that kind of thing. So that's a very like sort of traditional approach. So this event was intended to put those traditional rowers in a situation where they had to rely on the information that they were getting from other people, They couldn't go too fast at the beginning, but then they had to go too fast at the end of the 5 minutes. And so it was kind of meant to mess with their minds a little bit and get them to look around and see what everyone else was pulling.
When they were looking around, were they able to see the screens of the other rowers, or was it the data that was displayed on the kind of the main board, the broadcasting?
Exactly. So that's why it was so important to have this timing company working with us, because they were able to create like custom graphics for the spectators, but also for the athletes to see, so that the athletes could see where everybody else was, what splits everybody else was pulling throughout. And they could see a little boat tracker moving across the screen, and they could see if they were in first or in last or in the middle.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then so you said you didn't have a 2K in that event, so you had other were there any straight single distance rows, or were they all kind of creative events like what you've already mentioned?
So we tried to do everything pretty creatively. Like the 6K was a straight distance event, but it had this sort of huge variable thrown into it. We did halfway through the weekend, we did a 10K team row, and we took the top 2 men and the top male, the top female, the bottom male and the bottom female, and put them on a team. And then we did sort of 2-2-7-7 on a team, 3-3-6-6 to try and have evenly stacked teams. And these athletes did a 10K relay, but they had to switch every 250 meters. So again, that's a straight distance, but the transitions and how you switch between your teammates is so important, because 250 meters, is like a minute. It's less than a minute. So yes, you have to row fast and hard in that 1 minute, but your transitions are so important because there's like 40 transitions in that event. And that was really fun to get them to step into a team setting in the middle of an individual competition. We also did an elimination pyramid. So we did, I think they had to row like 800 meters head to head, and then they, would knock each other out 800 meters, 600 meters, 400 meters or something like that. So we did, there's only so much you can do, right? Like we didn't want to add any sort of functional fitness elements into it, like jump, burpees over a rower kind of thing, because we did want to stick to rowing and stick to what we know. But we wanted to show that there's so many different ways to train on the rowing machine, and also different ways to compete. We did one event, which was sort of our homage to the 2K. We did a 6-minute max effort row, which for a male athlete, 6 minutes is about, about a 2K, except we covered the screen. So the athletes couldn't see where they were. They could only see how much time they had left. And so it was basically a 6-minute max row. And the rower, the male rower that won that event, he's actually a Canadian guy named Jason Marshall. He's a former rugby player. And now he's, like a legend when it comes to any of the Concept 2 machines. But he won that event. And I remember thinking that, it's crazy that a non-traditional rower won what is sort of the closest to a 2K event. And I think the reason that he won is just because he was more comfortable not knowing where he was. He was more comfortable going into a challenge blind. Whereas, as I said, a rower has a very carved out plan of how they're going to attack a piece. And when you take out their ability to see their splits or see their stroke rate, they might struggle and they might not be comfortable with that discomfort.
That's interesting that it wasn't a rower that won, or it wasn't a traditional rower that won that event.
Yeah.
I would have thought that it would be a traditional rower that could just kind of put his head down and go.
Yeah, I think on the women's side, it was a traditional rower. It was the women's world record holder at the time. And she was pretty hard to beat in every event. Okay. She was sort of above and beyond, ahead above the other female competitors. But on the men's side, the top 2 guys I remember were pretty close. And the winner, Jason Marshall, I remember he broke 2K. So he actually rode a sub 6-minute 2K blind, which is a huge accomplishment. And I don't know if he's rode a sub 6 2K before that. I'm sure he had, but it's like, it was a really interesting event to see, because these guys had no idea where they were. They they thought they were at their max effort, but they could have only been at 80% because they couldn't see their splits. So it was really cool to kind of throw that variable in there and see how they dealt with it.
Hey guys, Justin here. Just a reminder, like and subscribe down below for more content coming soon from WODProof and the Difference Makers. That's really cool. Would you say that some of the people who are traditional rowers continue their career with some of the indoor and some of the events on the Concept 2 after they're done on the water? Or are athletes competing who are still also competing in traditional rowing on the water?
So we do have a big masters rowing community, both on the water and on the rowing machine. I think the thing with rowing is it's such a great fitness tool. There's a reason that it's one of the few machines that's in a CrossFit box. It's just such an incredible tool of fitness. And it's also very low impact. So as you get older, it's easier to row versus something like running, where you might struggle with the impact of running. So we do see a lot of rowers who finish rowing and they'll say, "Oh, I'm never rowing again. It's too hard. It's too painful." And then maybe after a couple of years, they come back to it because they just realize it's such a great way to stay in shape. And maybe they like the community element as well, especially if they're competing in a club. So we do see some rowers who finish rowing sort of competitively or in university and then go on to row at the master's level or sort of recreationally. But I think for those rowers as well, if you want rowing to become a lifetime sport, to have the only modality in competition be a 2K is quite boring. I mean, many rowers will row for decades. And if you're racing a 2K every single year, time and time again, and that's the only thing you're training for, you might have some people who fall off and just say, yeah, I peaked in college. I'm never going to get faster than I was. So I'm not so interested in this sport anymore. And if you give people an opportunity to compete in different formats, number one, it forces them to go to competitions because it's not something they can recreate at home. You can't recreate some of those formats that we did at the World Urban Games. You can't recreate those at home. So you need to be at the event to actually have that experience. And your ranking isn't based on just your sheer time. It's dependent on where you fell in the field that day. So I think it's also a way to even mixing up the formats, even though traditional rowers may not be in favor of it right away. I do think in the long run, it's going to keep them coming back to the sport because it's going to keep it interesting and fun.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like that adds a lot to the diversity and it makes it more interesting to watch. Like now that you're saying those events, I'm like, oh, that would be interesting to see. I'd never want to do them. I would not do well, but they'd be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I think you'd see different athletes from different backgrounds doing well in one event and maybe struggling in another, and that also makes great storytelling. And from this, the standpoint of working at a federation and wanting to showcase the sport, we need good stories. We can't have the same guy wins the world championships again, and he wins it at the same speed again. You want to be able to say, Justin was really strong in the short sort of sprinty wads, but now we're going to see him in these longer distances, or we're going to see him try to control his rate, and does he blow up? And I think that those just make such better stories for us to kind of help grow the community.
Definitely does. I know you had a big part to do with this, and you also had a big part to do with the change to make it a virtual rowing championship, or virtual rowing world championship last year. So what was obviously there's reasons why you didn't do it in person. I think we all know about that, but how did you make that change to make it virtual? And then what kind of events do you do at the virtual? Were you able to implement some of the things that you guys had experimented with at the World Urban Games?
So the World Rowing Virtual Indoor Championships we had actually been talking pre-COVID about adding like a virtual competition opportunity or adding a way for people to compete from home, but there was no sort of pressing urgency to implement it in 2021. So it's something that, we've been speaking with Concept 2 about doing very, very lightly. And then of course, after COVID kind of took over the world, it was a pretty easy decision to convert that event to a virtual event, because number one, we hadn't identified a host for the 2021 World Rowing Indoor Championships. So we were actually about to go out and try to find a host for the event. And we thought, this is too risky. No one's going to want to bid on an event when it may not happen in a year's time, which it definitely wouldn't have happened. So I'm glad that we proceeded the way that we did. So number one, we didn't have a host. And number two, we were seeing so many events being canceled or postponed left, right, and center. We just thought, let's not take the risk. Let's be proactive in planning a virtual event as opposed to reactive where, maybe we find out in 6 months that actually we need to plan this and we've missed all our time. So I think in April of 2020, we made the decision to host the 2021 World Rowing Indoor Championships virtually. And it was a big challenge. We'd never done it before. We also typically, the way that international federations work is we contract organizing committees in different cities around the world to run the events. Yeah. And then we have event managers who basically work with the organizing committees to help the delivery of the event. So we're not running the event ourselves. We're not doing the admin, the logistics. It's really the organizing committee that does that. So I think the first challenge for us was we became an organizing committee, which is not something that we normally do. And it was a lot of work. So if you are on an organizing committee for an event, then, we really appreciate the work that you do because we had to experience it ourselves a little bit. So that was the first thing. The second thing is because we were trying to connect hundreds of people from around the world in real time virtually, we were sort of at the mercy of their internet connections and their laptops and iPhones and, had they updated the firmware on their rowing machines. And we were really at the mercy of the user errors that could happen.
Yeah.
And that was something that because of that, we wanted to keep it simple. We didn't want to do these crazy formats and throw another thing into the mix. So we did stick with a more sort of traditional race format. We had 2Ks, we had 500 meters. We had a 60-minute row as well. And we did what's called a team test, which was sort of the virtual relay. It was like 4 people on a team would row max meters for 3 minutes. So those were the 4 different formats that we had. And in 2022, we will have a virtual option, but we will also have a physical in-person competition in Hamburg, Germany. And so that will be a new challenge. We've done in-person, we've done virtual, and in 2022, we will try to merge them together and do a hybrid event where people racing in Germany will race, someone from their basement in Sri Lanka in real time. And that will be its own challenge.
That'll be really cool to see.
Yeah.
Kinda
I hope so.
I think you guys will be good. That'll be cool to see the cross comparison there. I think people still travel for events and people still want to travel for events, but then it gives people the option who can't or are restricted for whatever reason, the opportunity to still compete.
100%. I think that's why we did it. I think people want to compete at events, and something you can't always recreate virtually is that those experiences like entering the competition floor or getting dressed, in the changing room and high-fiving your competitor or, whatever, helping somebody out and just that community experience is really hard to recreate virtually. So we didn't want to just have a virtual event if a physical in-person event was possible. But number one, we recognize that, there are different places in the world that are still really struggling with COVID and will not be able to travel to the event. And number two is, for depending on where the event is and where the competitor is coming from, it's a massive expense to fly somewhere just to race 2,000 meters.
100%.
And it's not a great value proposition, for someone. We have a competitor in Singapore named Jeremy Tan. And Jeremy, I think, told me he competed in Paris in 2020 at the World Rowing Indoor Championships. And I think he said something like the whole trip cost him almost $10,000, to fly from Singapore, to get hotel for a couple of nights for him and probably a supporter. The entry fee to the event is not expensive. It's only like 30 euros or something like this. But for him to actually go all the way there just to race 2,000 meters is a huge financial commitment. And you just think how many more people in the world might participate or might be inclined to participate if they could do it from home or if they could do it from their CrossFit gym.
Oh, 100%. Especially, I think if you get into that CrossFitter market, CrossFitter that just wants to pull on that chain really hard for, 2K, you can get some guys that can compete.
Totally. I think there's a huge opportunity for CrossFitters to really upset the indoor rowing sort of leaderboards. And I think the beauty of hopping into a new sport and sort of testing out where you are is that you don't necessarily have a lot of expectations of where you should be. So, they might not know that they're going really fast because they don't necessarily keep up with who in the world is breaking records or what is sort of the going splits for guys or girls their age. Yeah. So you don't have expectations and you might actually surprise yourself and do pretty well.
I might be mistaken, but didn't Sam Briggs set one of the world records for indoor rowing?
Yeah, she set, I think it was like a 500 meter lightweight in her age group. And, especially the shorter distances, we see a lot of CrossFitters or even like strongmen that are breaking world records. And that's exactly it, right? Like you change the stimulus of the workout and then all of a sudden you see, oh, that's not a rower. That's a person who's never stepped in a boat and probably will never step in a boat who's doing really well.
Yeah. I remember watching, I think it was Brian Shaw set some world record for like
100 meters.
200. Yeah. Like max 250 meters or something like that.
Yeah. It's crazy to watch these guys. I mean, you think some of them might actually rip the chain off of the erg because they're so strong. But yeah, it's really cool to see different people that kind of get interested in trying to break a world record on a rowing machine.
Yeah. Because you guys are on the machine so much, you rely pretty heavily on Concept 2 to support the organization. How does that partnership work? Like, you're relying really heavily on a, not like a manufacturer or like a boat manufacturer, but on a company who specializes in these pieces of equipment.
Totally.
How does that relationship work between the organization and Concept 2?
Concept 2 are amazing. They're the presenting sponsor of the World Rowing Indoor Championships. So they support that event every year. And even before they were the presenting sponsorship, they were the machine that was used every year at the World Championships. I would say Concept 2 is probably the machine that's used most often by traditional rowers, but also non-traditional rowers. It's sort of also the prevailing manufacturer that you see in CrossFit gyms. There are very few boxes that have other brands of machine. And it's really interesting, actually, if you haven't heard the story of Concept 2, definitely go on YouTube and try to find some videos, but they almost created the concept of indoor rowing competitions.
Yeah.
I think it was in Boston in the 70s or the 80s. Some rowers at Harvard actually said, it's too cold to train outside and we're bored with training and we want to throw together a little competition on the rowing machines. And so it was, they were rowed on Concept 2s and it was really rowers in the community that just decided, we want to compete on these machines. And they created this whole legacy, which is now like a very viable internationally competed sport. We have a great relationship with Concept 2. They support us in our events, not just our indoor events, but they also provide rowing machines at our on-water events for things like warming up and cooling down and for athletes to train on the side. They are very supportive of us, testing out the waters with new formats, new format ideas. Actually, the elimination race, the one where every 5 minutes somebody was eliminated, I'm pretty sure that idea came from one of the guys that works at Concept 2, Alex Dunn. And so, they're very open to seeing where indoor rowing can go. And I think that in that sense, we have a great relationship with them because we align in our goals. They want indoor rowing to be something that's really accessible and really widely recognized and understood by the fitness community. And we want that as well, because it is a type of rowing. And if it's rowing, then we want to support it and we want to cultivate that ecosystem. It's definitely a challenge because Concept 2 is not the only indoor rowing machine manufacturer. There are other manufacturers in the world. I don't know how many there are. There are hundreds. If you go on Amazon, you can buy a rowing machine for like $100. So we have relationships with other manufacturers as well. And I think that's, for us, really important to recognize that our goal is to grow the sport of rowing. And so we want to support different manufacturers to help us do that. But definitely with Concept 2, we have a special relationship with them just because of how they've helped to develop the discipline of indoor rowing and how much support they've put into us and to our events as well. They're also just really great people. They're really great people to work with, and it's a great business. So yeah, we love them.
Awesome. You just got back from Tokyo as well.
I did. Yeah, I'm still
you were there with the Paralympics.
On Tokyo time.
Yes. So you were there with the Paralympics.
Yes.
How do you support that event? Is it different than supporting what you did with the U.S. rowing team going to the Olympics prior to that? How does that work with all the different disciplines that you're dealing with the Paralympics as opposed to just the kind of the conventional Olympics?
Yeah, so definitely a different role in Tokyo than I've had previously with the U.S. team. With the U.S. team, I was really the manager. So I was the one, making sure that the athletes got from the village to the venue, warmed up to their boats on the water to the start line. I was the one making sure that, they had their meal tickets for the day and really handling a lot of the logistics for a small group of athletes. For World Rowing, I'm sort of the strategic manager for para rowing. So I work with what we call a commission. It's a group of people who are sort of nominated from all over the world who are experts in para rowing. And I work with them to help develop a strategy to grow para rowing and then implement that strategy with our events team, with our operations, marketing, communications team. So, in Tokyo, I was doing really anything that needed to be done. I was helping out our communications team, writing articles and getting quotes in the mix zone at the finish area. I was helping the World Rowing event manager who is responsible for the Paralympics. So obviously there was a whole layer of protocols that had to be added to the games as it related to COVID. And so I was there to support him if he needed any sort of COVID support. But we were actually really lucky. We didn't have any positive cases with the rowing group in Tokyo. So on that front, I didn't have very much to do. And we also had to do classification for some athletes, which I don't, every parasport has classification process. Essentially, it's the process by which athletes are assessed and then sort of categorized in the different groups based on their ability as it relates to that sport. So, we'll take an athlete with a physical impairment, for example, run a classification session with them where they have a couple of medical tests and they also do some testing on the erg. And then two classifiers will say, okay, based on what your function is on the rowing machine, we think that you should be in this category. And then they'll compete against other athletes that have a similar function, similar rowing function. And every sport has their own classification system. So we had to do some classifications at the games. And I supported the classifiers as well to process those athletes because normally we wouldn't classify at the games. But again, we had no events in the last year and a half. So we had to do some last minute ones in Tokyo.
That's kind of crazy that you had to do it on the spot in Tokyo. And then I guess the classification, does that take place prior to competition or they? Yeah.
It takes place the day before competition. And it is crazy. It's in a sort of a normal, like a world championships or a World Cup. We always have classification at events, and it usually happens a day or two before competition. But at the Paralympic Games, normally classification is not permitted. So athletes need to get classified at a previous event. But because we didn't have very many opportunities before the Paralympics for athletes to get classified, we had to offer it. We got an exemption from the International Paralympic Committee to be able to offer classification to some athletes. But you're right that normally we wouldn't do that at the Paralympic Games.
Okay.
But yeah, it's stressful, right? Because athletes could think that they're one sport class, one sort of category, and then be classified into something different. It doesn't happen as often as you might think because we're able to sort of look at their medical documentation in advance. And we always try to, be proactive. If someone might be a borderline case, we try to let them know in advance or get more information so we can help them prepare and help them plan. But the classification process is really important. And it's one of the sort of very important fundamental pillars of Paralympic sport, because it's what evens the playing field as much as possible in Paralympic sport. So it's really important to kind of create a fair environment for athletes to compete in.
Definitely is. I think it's so cool that what you do and how you're involved with the sport and trying to progress it. Now, you're also CrossFit coach part-time.
Yeah, I coach in the mornings at a gym in Switzerland.
Okay. Now, has that influenced how you're trying to diversify rowing at all and implement that? Like, because I know you've done CrossFit for a while. Has that impacted it, or has that been something that the World Rowing Federation has been trying to do for a while now with the indoor championships and different competitions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, CrossFit is definitely something that I'm really passionate about just as an athlete and as a coach. And I'm also a big fan. I love watching CrossFit competitions. I love watching people work out in my gym or watching the games. And I think that applying what I like about those things to something like indoor rowing, for example, where, it's a great concept to have multiple different formats and have athletes test out different formats. And then it's the overall points winner. That's a really great concept. And that's definitely something that, I wanted to bring that in. And that inspiration came from CrossFit. So I do think that it gives me a different perspective. And it gives me an idea on how can we make this interesting to sort of a wider group of people. I would say that's sort of the one area that it crosses over, is that it gives me a lot of inspiration and a lot of new ideas. I think the other sort of interesting parallel is that CrossFit is definitely also going through an exercise themselves to try and diversify the sport and improve their inclusion, improve the diversity across. I would say that in terms of gender equity, it's pretty good. I've always felt very, respected as a female coach and as a female athlete in CrossFit. But in terms of diversity and inclusion, I think both rowing and CrossFit have a ways to go. And so it's cool to see both of those organizations going on that journey at the same time. One, obviously, that's a lot newer, and one that has this sort of massive history behind it, and see how both organizations try to move forward as it relates to diversity and inclusion. So I think it's interesting to be reading about some of the things that CrossFit is doing to try and improve their diversity and think if that could be something that's applied to rowing or to indoor rowing. And then, I think generally it just gives me an appreciation for the different kinds of athletes that we have. CrossFit is infinitely adaptable, so it's a great sport for adaptive and para athletes. And I also get to work with para rowers very regularly. So it's really interesting to kind of see some of the para rowers cross training that they do on the side and the warm-ups that they do, and think, that would be a great way to actually adapt, a workout that we do in the CrossFit gym for an athlete that I have. So, there's not a ton of crossover in practice day to day, but definitely inspirationally it's there.
Right on. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. Before we wrap it up, where can everybody find you? Where can everybody find out more about the World Rowing Federation or some of the indoor events you guys have, or sorry, live events you have, live or virtual events you guys have coming up soon?
So our Instagram handle is World Rowing Official, and you can also go to our website, worldrowing.com. I'm definitely not an influencer, but my Instagram handle is Liz Soutter. And if you follow World Rowing, the World Rowing website or the World Rowing Instagram account, you'll definitely get information about upcoming indoor rowing events.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hit that like button and subscribe down below for more content coming soon from WODProof.